Hi there, good afternoon, econ class. I hope you all enjoyed your snow day. I hope that those of you who were sick, which apparently was several of you, have had a chance to fully recover and are glad to be back at school. I myself, as you can tell, have also been a little bit under the weather and have been trying to lose my voice for a couple of days, so I put off recording these lessons as long as I could to hopefully get some of that back. And now here we are. This is what we're working with. Hopefully we will make it through seamlessly and you all will understand everything you need to know about money by the time we get through with this lecture today. Before we get started, a few announcements. Next week, January 27th, is both Pajama Day and Pizza Lunch Day. Don't forget that if you do participate in our dress-up days, so if you come to class wearing pajamas next week, you will get extra credit. I will tack that extra credit onto a future quiz and it'll be worth 5 extra credit points. So, participate. And then also another friendly reminder, I have been asked to remind all of my classes that your phone should not be seen or heard at any time during our classes. That means if you've got it put away, which you should, you need it to be on silent, not vibrate, not making any other kind of noise in your backpack. So make sure you take care of that now if you haven't already, so that we don't have to see or hear your phone at any point during our class together. Okay, so today's lesson we are going to be talking about money and what exactly money is. It seems pretty straightforward. We know that you have to have it to spend something. Cash obviously is money, coins are obviously money, but there are lots of other things that we may not consider that could constitute money, and those are the things we're going to talk about today. How money came to be and exactly what the definition of money is. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the history of money. Before money came along, everybody was engaged in bartering. People bartered to get what they wanted. Bartering simply means exchanging one good or service for another. So for example, I'm a farmer and I raise chickens, and what I really want is a loaf of bread. I've got to go find a baker who is in need of a dozen eggs, for example, so that I can trade my chicken eggs for a loaf of bread. That's bartering. Okay, so you can see that in order for bartering to work, both parties have to want what the other party has. We call this the double coincidence of wants. My example worked because I found a baker who wanted chicken eggs, but if I found a baker who really needed a blacksmith, then the fact that all I have is chicken eggs to offer isn't going to do me any good. That's why bartering was really only practical in very small villages and for very simple needs. It wasn't long before bartering became too cumbersome. Like if I needed to buy a house or a horse, I would need a whole lot of chicken eggs. So it was only a matter of time before societies began to develop a better way of exchanging and engaging in commerce. So because bartering only works in small groups and it doesn't work very well in bigger groups, civilizations eventually developed money. So what is money? That's our million-dollar question. I'm going to say this slowly because I'm going to give you time to write it down. Money is anything that functions as a medium of exchange, a store of value, or standard of value. So what do we mean by those three things? That's our formal definition of money, and let's take a look at what that actually means. So for money to function as a medium of exchange, that just means it can be used for buying and selling goods. You can use it to purchase things. You can accept it from somebody else to sell them something. It's a medium of exchange. It's also functioning as a store of value. That means I can put $100 in the bank, and sometime in the future, that money is still going to be worth something. It is something I can use to store value. It doesn't become worthless after a certain amount of time. It doesn't have an expiration. It stores value. Now the value will fluctuate in time, obviously, but it's still the value of it. A $10 bill last week and next week is roughly the same. And then finally, it functions as what we call a standard of value. And what we mean by that is it's what we use to measure how much something is worth. If you're shopping for a car, you're going to look through different prices. You find one that's $7,000. That is the value that has been assigned to that product, and it was assigned to it in terms of money. We assign a money amount to tell us how much that item is worth, and that is the function of money that we refer to as a standard of value. It tells us the value of an item. So those are what we call the three functions of money. And now we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the three characteristics of money. Nope, not three, five. There's 5 characteristics of money. So in order for money to work well, regardless of what item is chosen to represent money in a given society, it has to fit into these 5 specific characteristics. The first one is what we call portability, and that simply means that it's something that you can carry around. There were ancient civilizations that would use large boulders or rocks or things like that to represent money, and obviously those are not very portable, so that would not fit in with what our characteristic of money is. It needs to be something that you can give to a person in order to receive an item from them, and so it needs to be something that is portable. The next characteristic of money is what we call durability, and that just means it's not very easily destroyed. If money were printed on the kind of paper that you write notes on in class, if you put that in your pocket and put your pants through the washing machine, then you would suddenly be very poor because that's not durable. So money is printed today on a special kind of paper that I'm sure you all have inadvertently put through the washing machine before, and it comes out maybe a little crinkly, but it still functions as money. So our money has that characteristic that we call durability. The next one is what we call divisibility, and that just means it can be broken up into smaller units. So if you need to make change for $1, for example, we've got coins. If you need to make change for a 20, there are smaller divisions of it that can be broken down. It needs to be able to be divided up into smaller units in order for it to be capable of being easily spent. If every bill that we printed were worth $1,000, for example, it would be really hard for you to buy a pack of chewing gum. So you've got to have some form of money that can be divisible in order for it to be a useful type of currency. The next one is something that we call stability. And what we mean by that is that the value of this money is relatively stable. Now, like I said, sometimes money does fluctuate in value over time with inflation and deflation, that sort of thing. But the main thing is that if I paid $10 for something today, that same thing is not going to cost $100 next week and then 50 cents the week after. Our dollar is relatively stable, and in order for money to function well, it needs to be a kind of currency that is relatively stable. And then the last one is what we call acceptability, and that just means that people are willing to give you some sort of good or perform some sort of service for you in exchange for that money. If they're not, then it's not what we would call acceptable. So for it to be acceptable, people have to be willing to take it in exchange for a good or a service. Now that we've taken a look at the characteristics of money and the function of money, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the evolution of money. So the first kind of money that ever existed was something that we refer to as commodity money. And this was when civilizations chose to use minerals or metals or crops as money. And we call those commodities because that means that those items actually could be used for some purpose other than money. They didn't exist just to function as money. They had some other use. Gold and silver coins, for example. Obviously, gold and silver has its own intrinsic value to be used for jewelry. So those items were valuable aside from their function as money. Tobacco was used in the colonial days as money to exchange, and obviously if you're a tobacco fan, then that had a value aside from its use as money. It was something that you would use to smoke, so that was a value for that commodity aside from its use as money. And in the Roman times, during the Roman Empire, Roman soldiers were actually commonly paid in salt, and salt was a very valuable commodity during the Roman Empire because it not only flavored food, but it was also used to preserve food. So That's actually a fun fact where the word salary comes from. It's got the same root word as the word salt, which is sal. So that's actually where that word salary comes from. So for these items, we call these commodity money because the money was an actual commodity that could be used for money, but it could also have some other function that it served besides just being used as money. Using commodity money worked pretty well unless you were trying to buy a really major purchase and you were going to pay for it in gold, because if you think about it, gold is obviously a very heavy, bulky item. And so that's when we developed something that is called representative money. That's what came next in the evolution of money. Commodity money was far too bulky. For example, like I said, gold would be way too heavy to make a major purchase. If you wanted to buy a whole horse, you might need a wheelbarrow in order to lug your gold to the person you were trying to buy your horse from. So what started happening instead is that goldsmiths would issue pieces of paper, receipts, that would show how much gold you had on reserve in their storehouse. And then instead of actually trading the physical gold, people would take their receipt, their piece of paper for their gold that they had on reserve at the blacksmith storehouse, and they would trade those receipts instead. So when it came time to go buy a horse, they would give the purchaser would give the seller his copy of the receipt that says, I've got 111 pounds of gold on reserve at the storehouse of this blacksmith, and now that you're in possession of this receipt, that gold all belongs to you. That was what we call representative money, and we call it that if you think about it because the receipt represents the real money. It's not the actual money, it just represents what the real money is, which is being held at the storehouse. So because people were already familiar with representative paper money, the next step seems pretty obvious. Why make paper redeemable for anything? Why does the receipt that you give to somebody in order to buy something need to be capable of being turned into a goldsmith and exchanged for gold? So in 1933, President Roosevelt, signed an order that made money no longer represented by gold. This was the end of what we called the gold standard or gold-backed dollars. So let's think about this for a second. What was going on in the United States in 1933? It was the middle of the Great Depression. And if you have a form of currency, like we did at that time, that is backed by gold, then the amount of growth that your economy is capable of is limited to the amount of gold that your country has. And in order to help the United States out of its very dark days and very dismal economic situation, FDR decided, and FDR signed, but lots of people who were smarter than he is in terms of economic strategy and growth planning, decided that it was no longer a good idea to limit our economic size to the amount of gold that our country had. And so that's why we did away with the gold backing that we had up until that point. That is what we call now an inconvertible fiat money. So I know those seem like two ridiculous words, but let's just break them down and think about what they are. First of all, fiat just means by authority of or some form of authorization by a government. And inconvertible is just the opposite of convertible, and that just means it's something that can't be converted. So when we say inconvertible fiat money, which is a popular catchphrase in the world of economics, all we're saying is by order of the government, this money can't be converted into anything else. You can't turn in your $5 bill and somebody will give you $5 worth of gold in exchange for it. I mean, I guess you could choose to use your $5 bill to buy something that's gold, but it's no longer true that each piece of paper represents a similar amount in gold. Instead, by authority of the government, because the government says so, we all agree that our money is worth what it is because we're willing to accept that the government says that that's what it's worth. This is what we have today in the United States. So we no longer have commodity money. We don't have a representative form of money. In the United States today, we have what we call an inconvertible fiat form of currency. And again, that just means that that money only has value because the government says that it does, and we're willing to accept that. That's why economists and your textbook and me like to call money your imaginary friend. Today's money gets even more complicated because we're not even any longer just talking about bills and coins. But let's think about it. You've got direct deposits, you pay your bills or do your shopping online, you use a debit card to pay for things, you write checks out to pay for things. It is possible in our current economy for you to go weeks or months without ever physically touching or seeing any kind of tangible money, and yet you're still surviving and thriving in our economy. The store of your money and checking accounts or savings accounts it doesn't mean that the bank has set aside $412.15 with your name on it in a vault somewhere. No, that money really just exists as information that's stored on a computer. So that's why we refer to money today as our imaginary friend. We've come a long way from the system where money was physical commodities like gold or salt or tobacco to now it's not even something that can be touched. Money really is just a construct. So we've talked about why using imaginary money instead of money that is actually tied to something like gold is beneficial. It allows the economy to expand beyond the extent of whatever gold might be on reserve in a country. But there are some drawbacks. One of those is because money is imaginary, we say that it's backed by nothing more than faith. And that faith needs to be bolstered by the credibility of the government that's backing it. In small countries, for example, it has happened time and time again throughout history where the currency of that country has failed because of the poor decisions that were made by the government that was issuing the currency. And we say that this system only works because the government says so, and everyone collectively has to believe it. We have to have faith in our government and in the value of our currency in order for the system to be sustainable. The problem is that faith can be eroded. And the biggest destroyer of money's value right now is what we call inflation. So inflation is caused by too much money in circulation. When the government has overprinted money, for example, then more people have access to more money, which decreases the purchasing power of the money. So if there's more money in circulation, then how much you can buy with those same dollar bills is decreased. That's the reason why the government doesn't just go crazy printing as much money as it needs or wants to pay back its debt, for example. We all know that the national debt is outrageous. And so you might think, well, why doesn't the United States just print more money? If it's not backed by anything, if it doesn't need to be tied to gold or some other commodity, why don't they just make more of it? And the reason is because if they made too much of it, then it wouldn't be worth very much. So in order to keep inflation in check and to preserve this really delicate balance where we all believe and have faith in our government's pronunciation that these dollars are worth this certain amount, we only get there by limiting the amount of money that's in circulation and keeping inflation in check. One of the main ways that the government keeps inflation in check, in addition to limiting the amount of money and currency that they print that's in circulation, is they control rates of interest. You've probably heard headlines on the news where they say the Fed is meeting this week to discuss interest rates. And we're going to spend some more time down the road talking about the Federal Reserve and what their policy making does to the economy. But for now, just know that interest rates or interest is nothing more than a payment for using money. So when you borrow money, you're holding on to it for a certain amount of time, and as you repay it to the person who lent it to you, you're going to give them back a little extra on top of what you borrowed to make up for the fact that they are without the use of that money during the time that you're holding on to it. So that is all that interest is. Interest is just the payment that you have to pay in order to use money. The price that the amount that you're charged is called the interest rate. Most of you are familiar with that term, I would say. An interest rate is determined by a set of 5 blocks. These are the 5 things that stack up in order to determine what an interest rate is. Now, there is a very thorough discussion in your textbook about what each of these 5 things is, and we don't have a ton of time left in this presentation because I don't know how long it took you to take your quiz, so I'm going to list those 5 factors here, the 5 blocks, but I want you to, when you read about them in your textbook this week, I want you to take a minute to think about each of these in a little more detail, and there is a really good description of it in your textbook for you. But those factors are, those blocks are the cost, that's the amount of money that you start with, the expected inflation rate. So if I'm borrowing money for a year, or if I'm borrowing money for 30 years for a home mortgage, for example, the amount of money is going to, what the amount of money is going to be worth in the long run is a lot greater than it would be for a short-term loan. So we have to take into account the expected inflation rate over the term of the loan. The default risk premium, that means how risky is the loan that the person is making. The liquidity premium, that just means the fact that this money is no longer liquid is worth something. There's something we have to charge in order to make up for the fact that this money is now tied up, being used to pay for something else for the next however many months or years. And then finally, the maturity risk premium. That means how likely is it for this loan to get paid off at or by the date that this loan is maturing. So again, there's a much more detailed discussion of these topics in your textbook for you to read, but for now I just wanted to list those 5 things, and I want to point out that that's something that you do need to spend some time learning about this week. Okay, so that's it for this week's topic of money, everybody's favorite imaginary friend. This week for homework, you are going to answer the questions that are on page 13 of our course Spirals, and then make sure that you have added your 3 stock prices next to this week's entry on the chart in your economics project folders for your stock market project. Let me just say there are still 1 or 2 of you, 3 maybe, who have not sent me the names of the 3 companies that you are tracking for your stock market project this semester. I need those like yesterday, because if you have a duplicate, if you are tracking a company that somebody else has already claimed and I haven't heard from you yet, you're going to have to change it. And making a change further into the semester obviously is going to be harder to do because you won't be able to go back and find the prices for previous weeks. So if I have not heard from you yet, it is imperative that you send me a text message or an email with the name of the 3 companies that you're tracking for your stock market project. All right, that's it. Happy Monday.